It is wonderful having you here for the podcast and as we celebrate a new year.
It's great to be here. It's great to be in a new year. Time for new things to start and get everything going for hopefully a better 2023 than any of us may have had in 2022 or 2021
or 2020. Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the Called2B Podcast, where we seek to empower everyday believers to discover and live out their authentic calling in Christ to be a greater blessing in our world today. I'm Reverend Dr. Travis Guzzi. I'm a pastor as well as an ICF certified life and executive coach and a Gallup Strengths coach. And we want to welcome our listening and viewing audience to this January New Year 2023 podcast. And it's great having all of you with us. And in studio, I have Trish Freshwater, one of my co-hosts who joins us. And Trish, it is wonderful having you here for the podcast and as we celebrate a new year.
It's great to be here. It's great to be in a new year. Time for new things to start and get everything going for hopefully a better 2023 than any of us may have had in 2022 or
2021 or 2020.
We're going to hope we're on that upward slide.
Yes. Here, one of these years, it should be better than it was before.
Yes,
so very
ever
good.
Hopeful.
Yes. Hey, Trish, what are we going to be talking about on this podcast
Well,
today?
Speaking of changes, we're hoping to talk about today a little bit more about transitions and transitions in our lives.
Right.
This is a great time of year to be thinking about change, but it's also what are we experiencing in our worlds and how do we transition from one place to another, whether it's in our jobs, maybe we're moving, maybe we have things happening in our families, but there's a lot of things that we transition throughout life, and we'll talk more about how we can approach those transitions as they come.
Yeah, and I think this is important too, especially as we come to a new year. There's always the idea of leaving behind what was. There's leaning in to what's new, and with that, oftentimes there are new things. There's changes that happen in our life, and so how do we navigate that as God's people? I'd like to start today by just asking, I know you have been going through some transitions. You have started a new job within the last year?
It's been just over a year.
Yeah.
But when do you stop saying you're new? When are you not the new employee anymore?
Well, I'll tell you, my role with the Southeastern District, I played that newbie card for 3 years.
Oh, good. I got a year and a half to go.
There you go. But also you not only started a new degree program, you actually changed degree programs. So you've had a lot of transition in your life. What's that experience been like for you?
So it's, for most people, I fall into that bucket. Change is hard. Nobody likes the idea of change because change means you have to let go of what was and accept what's new. Even when you're excited about the change, sometimes it can be hard to make that shift. And especially when in a job, for example, where you worked for almost a dozen years, you have to leave all the people you worked with, the processes you knew. You have to, everything that you knew about your world is going to be turned inside out and changed. You walk into the new job. Of course, my job is virtual, but it's still the same. You walk into the virtual meetings or the email inbox and you're like, I don't know who any of these people are. And you feel a little unsettled and you're not exactly sure, who do I call? What do I say? Who's going to be kind? Who's got the different personalities? We all have those personalities we have to worry about. Yeah. And you don't know who they are yet. So that transition can be very difficult, not only from a people perspective, but then how do I do my job and what is expected? What is the norm? What is the culture? And what is coming?
Culture, I think, is a big thing. I think we underestimate it because we get used to, whenever you have individuals, groups of people who are together, there is a culture. Families have cultures. Friend groups have cultures, schools, organizations, communities you live in. And whenever you come in new, I think it's learning that culture, the norms, how things are, what's expected. And when things are different from what we're used to, that's tough. I know I moved up to Canada one time. That was one of my first jobs. And when my wife and I moved up there were things that were just different in Canada. Even though the border, we could drive to the U.S. within an hour and be back in the U.S., but the potato chips were different. The ice cream was different, and it was enough that it's similar, but there's some things here that I'm not used to.
Well, been through that same experience. Not to pick on any parts of the country, but I did I grew up on Eastern Long Island and went to college in upstate New York. And then I moved to Southeast Mississippi. That is,
I bet that was a culture change.
It was very different. But, once you get in and you learn, you meet people, you find people are people everywhere. They might sound different. They might have a different accent. There might be different restaurants, different grocery stores, but it's all good.
Yeah. What makes transitions especially tough? What's been your experience with that?
I think it really has to do with the change aspect and letting go of what you are used to. Everybody likes things to carry on, to continue in the same way over and over. We're creatures of habit, all of us. And anytime you try to rock that boat, people get a little nervous. They're worried about what that change is going to bring. Even if it looks good, sometimes it's like, but this is safe. Over here, it's safe where I've been.
Right. It's interesting because I'm kind of going through some change in my role with the Southeastern District. And I'm a person that embraces change. I like change. I navigate the ambiguity pretty well. But it's interesting because in the last 6 months, I've been kind of in a funk. And it's interesting. One, we have a new district president. My role is changing. And I was trying to identify, okay, I typically like change. What's going on? And it was actually just not too long ago. We were out visiting our son for his Christmas concert. And suddenly I realized that one of the things that I think has really affected me was I was mourning. Because we've had a lot of staff members over the last 6+ years who have changed and retirements. And actually, we just had a long-time member of the staff, Don Schaefer, who just retired. And I suddenly realized I was mourning, and I didn't even recognize what was going on. Mourning mourning the relationships and the changes that happened. It's not that the new is bad, the new role, the new people coming on, but you do, have to kind of go through a mourning process from the old as you start leaning into the new.
Absolutely. And I'm a relationship person. So the people I work with are super important to me, and experience that same thing, leaving my old job, because they were family.
Yeah.
And those are the people you lean on. You talk to them, you share your world with them, and suddenly they're not part of your day-to-day.
Yeah. As much as work may be tasks and structure and reporting and things you have to do, it's still people. It's still organization, but it's people that make it up. And so it's recognizing the relational part of that can be very tough in those times of change. Well, I want to share something as maybe our listening and viewing audience. Maybe we've got some folks who are navigating transitions in life as they go from what was in the old year to the new year. And there was a book called Managing Transitions by William Bridges, which actually the name Bridges, I think.
Kind of coincidence there.
It seems like he was foreordained to write a book. Yeah. He talked about, as we step from the old into the new. And so there's this idea that as we think about that new beginning that we're getting ready to step into, that there's ending that has to happen. There is losing, there's letting go. There's necessary endings that need to happen. And we talked about that in our last podcast on Sensing God's Will, that there's that disciplined engagement, but there's also a disciplined disengagement that happens. That might be relationships. That might be a place we used to live. It might be certain tasks or a role that we had. So while the new may be exciting, there's letting go. And then there's something called the neutral zone. I kind of think of Klingons and Star Trek in it. You weren't supposed to go into the neutral zone because that was a place of danger and anything could happen. A war could break out. But as you transition that neutral zone, that's not always easy. And not everybody and not every organization even or business or ministry makes it across that neutral zone to that new beginning because it's filled with threat. It's filled with change. It's filled with emotions, maybe anxiety builds, a fight or flight response happens.
So this really matches up really great with some of my coursework. Right now, I'm taking...
What are you studying?
So I'm studying industrial organizational psychology. And part of the master's program is they make you take a lot of foundational classes in psychology, even though that's not directly related to the psychology of work.
Right.
But the class I'm in now is life development. So we're talking a lot about the transitions and the changes from childhood to adolescence and adulthood. And adolescence, of course, we all know, is that huge transitional time period. So I think it fits nicely in this neutral zone. It's where you're letting go of that childhood. Everything you knew your entire life is now no more.
Right.
And you want to become that new beginning. You want to become that adult. And sometimes as a teen, we see ourselves as that adult, even though we're not there yet.
Yeah.
But in that neutral zone, you're trying on all these different pieces and parts of your personality. And you're taking those pieces and saying, nope, I don't think I like that anymore. I'm not going to be that way. Ooh, but my friend over here, I like the way she's doing it. So I'm going to try that for a little while.
Yeah.
And that's where you see teenagers going through all of these crazy stages, whether it's the outfits or the hair, the makeup, the attitude.
And the stress and the anxiety
Yes,
and
lots
the
of anxiety.
depression and the fear. And I remember my son, I don't know about your kids, but there were times it's like he's insisting, I want to be an adult. And then yet the next moment he wants to be treated like a
push
kid.
And pull.
Yeah.
They hold on to childhood so hard.
And yet they yearn to become an adult and that freedom. And it's a tough transition.
It really is.
And it's not just in adolescence. I mean, it's in all of life. So the imagery I think of is the Oregon Trail. So, you think back in the day when the promise of Oregon and all the people who would set off in those wagon trains from St. Louis, and they're going along. And what's interesting was not everybody made it to Oregon. Some people started off on that Oregon Trail, and they finally, maybe some wife was like, well, heck with this. This is too tough. With all the challenges, the wagon breaking down, the Native Americans who were attacking, robbers hitting them on the road, that they turned back and went to St. Louis.
So this is not the computer game, right?
No. Well, no. I think I love the computer game. There's actually a card game, too, that's fun. Dysentery that happens, your cattle die. But that was real life, though. It
was. It was a fun game, too.
Yeah. and then yet other people, what's interesting is if you look at the Oregon Trail, there are communities all along the Oregon Trail that I think people got so far and they said, okay, this is no further, and we're just going to stop here. And so communities were born. And then finally, some people made it all the way. But it took discipline, it took perseverance, it took the letting go and learning to embrace and managing the emotions to be able to do that.
And I think part of that too is keeping your eye on what that future looks like.
Right.
And really knowing that's where I'm headed and that's my goal. And I think sometimes people get lost maybe in that neutral zone because they lose sight of what that goal is.
Either they get focused on the trials of where they're at in the change process, or they look back, kind of longing for what was. Actually, I've got an interesting Bible verse. God's people went through a transition from the neutral zone when they came an exodus out of Egypt, heading to that promised land. And yet, as they were in that wilderness experience, that neutral zone, things got kind of tough for them. Even this quote from Exodus 16:3, the Israelites said to them, they were grumbling against Moses, if only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. God, only if you had taken our lives. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into the desert to starve this entire assembly to death. And I mean, it's like, they're glorifying the past of, the good old days when we were in Egypt. We had all this food. Life was easy. Forgetting you were slaves, and so it's easy for us to romanticize the past and not realize sometimes the challenges and the struggles that we had. And here they're focusing on their current struggles, the past of what it was, rather than God was with them. He was calling them to the promised land and becoming the people he desired them to be.
Right. And it's easy to forget. What you went through. It's easy to look back and be like, oh no, but it was fine. It was totally fine.
Yeah, my childhood was great. And it's like, no, my childhood was really filled with turmoil and struggle as well. But yeah, we glorify the past in a lot of ways. But it's, I think what you said, it's keeping your eye on the prize. And God's people who went in, they had to learn to not focus on who they were, but to who God had called them to be. There's another thing that we've got to, as we manage transition in life, is sometimes I think we have an incorrect view of the true nature of life. And so I think a lot of people view life this way. It's out of the linear or the steady state rule. And they tend to see life as just this continuous going up, this continuous gradual improvement in
all
life.
Smooth, no problems.
That's right.
Everything's going to be great.
Things don't change. Things don't, there's not difference that happens. And perhaps there was a time in the past in which maybe life was more like this. You know, generations past, you know, when we were more of a rural agricultural culture, where your grandfather was a farmer, your father was a farmer, you'd be a farmer, your kids would be a farmer. Maybe there wasn't a lot of change and transition. Things were pretty steady state in life. But I think in our world, especially our world today, with all the technological changes and the economic, the globalization, all that's happening around us, that I think what we see is much more of a continuous change rule, that as we go through life, there are these cycles of change. There's these cycles of transition that we go through. And it's not just one or two, but it's multiple that we go through in life, especially as we consider the workplace. You were talking the realities of the workplace. How long does somebody stay at a job?
Yeah, these days, our younger generations, they'll job hop. They'll be there about 2 years, maybe 3, then they get a new job. And some of it's the realities of today's world. They want to advance themselves, and advancement isn't always available where they are. So to get that promotion, to get that raise, they move on to another position, another company. But then...
and sometimes even totally different careers.
Yes, and we see a lot of the lattice. And, you know, the career ladder is really no more. It's no longer just up and down. It's a career lattice. And people are moving a little bit to the right and then maybe a little bit upwards and left. And they're moving around trying to find that good fit, what feels good to them and what makes them happy. And of course, since COVID, we've seen a lot of changes in what people think is where they want to be. And so we see a lot more of this movement. Whereas, like you were saying, you know, in the old days, the old days of 5 years ago, we would see people who want to stay with a company for 10, 15, 20 years, live their whole career at a particular company and be celebrated when they retire. And now you don't see that.
Yeah. I mean, I remember like my grandfather, you know, I mean, you think back in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s.
And people pass their businesses on to their children.
Yeah. You know, that there was this, not only a commitment of the employees to the companies, but the companies, the commitment to their employees as well. I think on both ends, that kind of commitment and staying with one company for your entire career just almost doesn't exist anymore.
I mean, even the loss of pensions. You don't have pensions anymore. People are, what's the incentive to stay? Right,
exactly. And so what we see often is not only these transitions of jobs, but total careers I mean, I've read that young people today, they may have like 7 different careers in their life by the time they're done. Just again, because of layoffs, change in technology, you have to continually retool. But this also goes into our personal life. I mean, you know, we have we grow up, as you said, in adolescence. We go to college. We get our first job. We get married. We have our kids. Our kids move out of the house, and the change and transition that happens with that. I know we've recently become empty nesters, and that was hard. I mean, it was challenging.
I'm not looking forward to that.
Yeah, you got that coming up. You got teenagers in the house still,
we're
right?
on our way to the college plan. But you know, the same thing too is if you think back on our lives. Long ago, you bought a house, you stayed in that house, you didn't move. Now, how many places have we all lived? Even though, you know, you think about the military community and they're used to that transition every 3 to 4 years, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, depending on their career field. But how many places have we all lived? I mean, gosh, when I was growing up, we were told, you know, you're always going to live here. And I always thought, well, I don't want to be on Long Island forever. And I've lived in Long Island, Syracuse, Poughkeepsie, all up in upstate New York. And then I went to Mississippi, and then I lived in Charleston, and now I'm here.
Yeah.
And within that, how many apartments did I live in my 20s?
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
You know, it's not that consistent place.
Yeah.
Home is where the heart is, has become more real.
Yeah, I think the Apostle Paul still has me beat by a few moves in my life, but I'm quickly catching up. And honestly, this role where I'm at right now here in Williamsburg with the Southeastern District is the longest I've ever been anywhere, which is really crazy for me to even think about that because, and it's not just around the U.S. My wife and I, we've lived in 2 countries. We've lived in Canada and we've lived in Singapore. And in today's global world, moving to another country is almost like what it used to be for people moving from state to state. And so it's a different reality we live in today.
Yep.
So here's the challenge. We could fight this. We could complain against this. We can try to deny that this happens, or we can recognize, no, this is life, and we can lean into it and learn from it and grow. And I think it's the intentionality of not only the recognition, but how we can intentionally work through the process that we can come out better, and God can do some amazing things in that. So there's something I share in my coaching and ministry with a lot of people, this idea of the renewal cycle. So when those times of transition and change happen, if you are intentional about it, there can be some great things that come. So there's kind of 4 phases to this for personal reorganization and revitalization between life chapters. And in a sense, when these happen, I think it's kind of like a story or a book, thinking of them as life chapters. So the first phase is go for it. That's whenever we start something new, new career, a new family, beginning, getting married, having kids, whatever it might be. It's positive. Usually you've got goals, you're committed to it. But then as time goes on, it could be quick. It could be a little bit longer. But there comes phase 2, which is being stuck in the doldrums, where things change from being positive to more negative. We start getting reactive. Sometimes that fight or flight response starts happening within us. Anxiety begins to grow. Disengagement can happen. We start feeling trapped in life. Now, there's 2 things that can happen. If within wherever we're at, the calling that we have, there can be many transitions. Sometimes it's just a matter of recommitting, setting new goals, seeing the blessings and the positive, that we can make kind of a transition across the circle right back to the go for it stage. Sometimes it doesn't take a lot, but sometimes the transitions are so significant in life that we have to go through a much more intentional transition process. And so it goes into phase 3, cocooning. You think of the caterpillar that goes into the cocoon, getting ready for the transition to become the butterfly. In that, it's turning inward. It's tapping and evaluating our values, what's important in life, and awakening to who we are and new possibilities. And then finally, it's then phase 4. Getting ready for the next chapter. This is where we start exploring possibilities. We start networking with other people. We start training and equipping and retooling ourselves for what that next chapter is going to be, so that we can get back to that go for it phase 1 stage again.
And that, I'm thinking as you're talking about our move here and in the wake of leaving my marriage, you get all excited about the move because it's something positive to think about. And you're like, yes, this is great. It's going to be a new beginning. It's going to be wonderful. We're going to have new things, new places. And then you're like, oh my gosh, the reality. The reality, I have all these things to do, and the change. And then you get stuck in that little space for a little while until you start to really think about what is it that this move is going to do for us? What are the things that are going to be better in the future? Yeah. And then you get focused again, refocused on those goals and that end prize of where you're headed in life. Yeah. And then that gives you that emphasis, or not the emphasis, but the energy to keep moving and carry through. Yeah. Well, all the way back to our first Called2B podcast, where I talked about my life story and the transition that happened from full-time ministry as a pastor, my first call, and leaving that. And this was true to who I was. There was the feeling trapped. And then unfortunately, I succumbed to the fight or flight. And got into a kind of an in-between time where I didn't have a call in a ministry. But that was also not necessarily a bad time, because it was in that time that I rediscovered who I was. You jumped into cocooning. I did. God showed me, like the children of Israel, what my true identity was, tapped into my values, what's important, and then began to the next chapter, retooling, learning about coaching, vocation, and thinking about what God could do in that next chapter of life and getting ready for it. And so again, it's either we fight it or we lean into it. And it can be tough, but I think the promise for us, especially as we look at the idea of calling and vocation, is we don't go through this alone. God is with us
even in the transitions. And while I know for me emotionally, the depression I went through, I didn't want to be there. The truth is that reality is not always what our feelings tell us. There's a truth outside of us, that God is with us. He loves us. He wants something good. He wants to do something in that process to make us better, to sharpen us up again for whatever may come. I remember years ago, there was a book by Max Lucado called On the Anvil. And he had a short story about how do you know pottery is ready after you've fired it. And he said it's when you flick it. Does it thud or does it ring?
Oh, interesting.
If it thuds, you put it back in the fire for a little more firing. If it rings, it's ready. And I think it's in this transition, this renewal cycle. God's doing some thudding on our life. And if, sometimes we got to stay in it a little bit longer because he's got more work to do.
I think sometimes we might feel that thud.
Yeah, exactly. But that point when we ring, that's when we're ready for that next chapter of life. There's a final quote I'd like to share with you, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this. For me, I'm a big Luther guy. Luther was, he's the guy when it comes to calling and vocation. He had this quote that I think speaks so much about this idea of not only life and calling, but also the transitions and how God works in it. He says this life is not righteousness, but growth in righteousness. It is not health, but healing, not being, but becoming. Not rest, but exercise. We are not yet what we shall be, but we are growing toward it. The process is not yet finished, but it is going on. This is not the end, but it is the road. All does not yet gleam in glory, but all is being purified.
I absolutely love this quote. And it kind of brings back to that one quote that you hear all the time that's very succinct is the best is yet to come. And I think that's a great way to think about the new year and to think as we go into 2023, the best is yet to come. Yes, we've had a handful of difficult and challenging, maybe transitional years as we've all learned about COVID and new society and new things that are happening in our world, new processes. But God is with us through all of it.
Yeah.
And we are reaching towards that next best thing that's going to be part of our lives.
Yeah. And not only for eternity, because that's the end of the road, but even on the journey, the work that God wants to do, even in the transitions of life. Again, they may be challenging. Maybe you don't like them. Maybe you want to run away from them. But God wants to do a good thing in our life to prepare us for what that next chapter is going to be so that we can be a greater blessing for others and be used for his purposes. Trish, as we wrap up this podcast, what should our listeners and viewers be taking away? What are some things that you took away from this?
So I think the biggest thing is, change is hard. Transitions can be difficult, but they also yield so much for us in the end. And letting go is the hardest part.
Yeah.
Absolutely. If we can commit ourselves to let go of the past and look forward and try to keep our eye on what that thing is in the future that we're moving towards. And is it something that God is pushing us towards that even gives you some extra reason to keep that eye on the forward-looking front? Yeah.
And that God is with you in the midst of it. Yeah. Wonderful. Well, hey, thank you so much. We want to thank our listening and viewing audience for joining us for this Called2B podcast. We really find it to be a blessing and a joy to be able to bring this podcast to you each and every month. We want to encourage you, if you have been blessed by this podcast, not only listen and like it on our different platforms, but also make sure to share it with somebody else. Maybe somebody who's going through a difficult time, a time of transition, that maybe this might be a podcast that would give them a little bit of encouragement in life. Also, too, maybe you are somebody who is going through a time of transition. The most difficult thing, and I've learned this, I think, Trish, you could say this too, is that you don't have to go it alone. So I'd encourage you, reach out to us at Called2B Podcast at gmail.com if you would like to maybe talk about having myself or somebody else serve as a coach for you. Be happy to talk to you about the benefits of coaching. And I know that in my life, in my times of transition, having a coach with me on the journey and not going alone has been a huge blessing. Somebody kind of outside of my circumstances to help me see the reality of the situation, the possibilities, do some goal setting, developing a strategy, and providing some encouragement support can be a huge blessing. And maybe that could be for you as well. As always, we want to thank our sponsors, Malem and the Southeastern District, for their generous gifts that have made this podcast possible. And with that, we want to wish you all God's richest blessings, and we'll catch you for the next Called2B podcast. Take care, everybody.